He saw the dog hanging off the cliff, claws slipping, eyes pleading. Jack didn't hesitate. He pulled him up and unknowingly unleashed a storm. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the start of a deadly game, because that dog wasn't lost. He was being hunted. It's about what happened after, and it shocked everyone who saw it. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the rocky cliffs of Iron Ridge. Jack hadn't planned to hike this far. He wasn't even sure why he'd kept walking after the trail ended. Something about the silence, the kind that presses into your ears and settles in your chest, felt oddly calming. He was nearing the edge of a narrow overlook when he heard it. At first, it sounded like wind, or maybe the screech of a bird overhead. But then came a distinct, desperate sound, scrambling paws, the sharp clatter of claws on stone, a muffled, panicked yelp. Jack froze. He scanned the ledge ahead, heart rate rising. The sound came again, closer now. Without thinking, he broke into a sprint toward the edge, gravel crunching beneath his boots. As he rounded a jagged boulder, the scene unfolded like something out of a nightmare. A large German shepherd, its coat dusted with dirt and brambles, was clinging to the edge of the cliff. Its front legs were barely hooked over the lip of the rock, hind legs dangling in open air. The dog's body trembled with every shallow breath, its claws scraping against the stone in a losing battle to stay up. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees, lunging forward and grabbing the dog by its thick ruff, just as one of its front paws slipped. The dog let out a short, terrified bark, then silence. Its weight yanked hard against Jack's grip, pulling him dangerously close to the edge. Loose pebbles tumbled over and disappeared into the ravine below. "Hang on!" Jack growled through gritted teeth. With one foot braced behind a rock and both arms straining, he slowly began pulling the dog up, its eyes, wild with panic, locked onto his, not pleading, trusting. As if, in the moment of near death, time seemed to fold in on itself. The weight of the dog pulled Jack forward by inches, his knees grinding into the gravel, fingertips screaming from the strain. One wrong move, one shift in weight, and they'd both be gone. The canyon below stretched into a deadly silence, waiting. The dog didn't whimper, it didn't struggle. It just looked at him with a raw, unwavering focus that somehow steadied Jack's breath. He didn't think about himself. He didn't have time to calculate risk. There was no one else out there, no help to call, no harness to grab. Just two living beings suspended in a moment between survival and loss. Jack tightened his grip on the dog's scruff, feeling fur, skin, muscle beneath his fingers. "Come on," he growled under his breath. "Don't let go." Using his legs as leverage, Jack shifted his body back an inch, then another. His boots scraped against stone, anchoring him as he slowly dragged the animal upward. It was like hauling a sandbag with teeth, but Jack wasn't letting go. Not now, not ever. Then, finally, he felt the weight shift. The dog's paws scraped higher on the ledge. Jack used the momentum to pull harder, feeling the animal's back legs scrape the edge. And then, suddenly, the full weight of the German shepherd collapsed into his lap. They both rolled backward, a mess of limbs, panting and coughing and covered in dust. Jack let out a shaky laugh, more from disbelief than humor. The dog didn't run, it didn't bark. It simply stood, shaking, and stared at Jack as if memorizing his face. Jack reached out slowly, palm open. "You okay, big guy?" he asked softly. The dog took a step closer. No growl, no fear. Just a quiet, almost reverent stillness. Then, to Jack's surprise, the German shepherd rested its head against his shoulder, just for a moment. That was when Jack realized this wasn't a stray. The dog had a thick collar, frayed but intact, with no tag. Its coat was dirty, but underneath the grime was muscle, strength, and something else. Training. Jack had worked around dogs enough to see it, the way it moved, the way it watched. This dog wasn't lost. It had been somewhere, had done something. But why was it alone out here? Jack looked around. No camps, no hikers, no trails for miles. Whoever had owned this dog wasn't nearby. Or worse, they'd abandoned him on purpose. The thought tightened Jack's chest. He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans. The dog followed him, step for step, eyes never leaving his. Jack looked down the trail he came from, then back at the dog. "This wasn't supposed to happen today," he said with a dry laugh. The dog gave a faint tilt of the head, ears perked, as if listening. Jack sighed and gave in. "All right," he muttered. "Come on, partner." The shepherd didn't hesitate. It fell into step beside him, like it had always belonged there. That's how it started. Not with a plan, not with a rescue mission. Just a split-second decision, one life saving another. Neither of them knew it then, but that choice would set off a chain of events that no one, especially Jack, was prepared for. And the unthinkable was still waiting. Jack's legs ached with each step down the trail, but he didn't stop. The adrenaline had faded, replaced with a soreness that sank into his spine. Behind him, the German shepherd followed quietly, never straying, never slowing. Every so often, Jack glanced back. The dog didn't pant or pull. He just walked like he knew the way, or trusted Jack enough to follow him into the unknown. The descent from Iron Ridge wasn't easy. Steep slopes, loose gravel, and sudden turns made it treacherous even in daylight. But the sun was now dipping fast, and shadows grew long across the forest floor. Jack knew he had to get down before nightfall, not just for his own safety, but for the dogs too. The last thing either of them needed was to be stuck overnight with no gear and coyotes prowling. As they neared a narrow switchback, Jack paused to catch his breath. His boots skidded slightly on the edge, sending a few pebbles tumbling into the gorge. The shepherd stopped beside him and sat, alert but calm. Jack looked down at him and gave a faint smile. "You're not even tired, are you?" The dog blinked, his amber eyes shining in the fading light. Jack shook his head. "You're something else." But even as he said it, something about the dog's posture nagged at him. It was too precise, too disciplined. Jack had spent enough time with working breeds to recognize that stance. This dog wasn't just loyal, he'd been trained. Maybe military, maybe search and rescue, maybe something darker. The trail widened as they reached the lower path near the river. Jack stepped down from a ridge and stumbled slightly, his legs giving under the long hike. Instantly, he felt pressure against his side. The dog had moved in, steadying him, bracing his shoulder against Jack's hip like a living crutch. Not barking, not seeking praise, just responding. Jack steadied himself and stared at the dog. "Where did you learn that?" The shepherd didn't answer, of course, but his stillness said everything. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the first stars had appeared. Jack led them to his old pickup truck, parked near a gravel turnout. He opened the passenger door and hesitated. "You coming?" Without a second of delay, the shepherd jumped inside, curled up on the seat, and looked out the windshield as if it was routine. Jack shut the door slowly, walking around to the driver's side, with 1,000 thoughts colliding in his head. This wasn't a normal rescue. This wasn't a lost pet. This was something else. Back at his cabin, nestled on the edge of the pines, Jack laid a blanket near the fireplace and filled a bowl with water. The dog drank deeply, then laid down with a heavy sigh. Not from exhaustion, but peace. Jack watched from the couch, his own body sinking into stillness. That image stuck with him, the dog lying safe, warm, alive, and he thought back to the moment on the cliff. That moment where he reached for the fur, where he almost slipped, where he chose not to let go. It wasn't just about saving the dog anymore. Somewhere deep in his gut, Jack felt it. This dog might have just saved him too, and neither of them knew. This was only the beginning. The next morning arrived slower than usual. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of Jack's cabin, casting soft patterns across the hardwood floor. He woke stiff, every muscle sore from the climb, the pull, the weight of the dog. But something deeper stirred, a quiet unease, like the kind that lingers after a dream you can't quite shake. He sat up, half expecting the dog to be gone. But there he was, curled beside the cold fireplace, chest rising steadily. Not chained, not leashed, yet he hadn't tried to run. Jack took a few slow steps toward him. The dog's ears twitched, then his eyes opened. Alert, not startled. As if he'd been awake longer than he let on. "Morning," Jack murmured. The shepherd stood, stretched, and walked over. Not with a wag, but with a kind of calm readiness. Jack reached out and scratched behind his ear. The dog leaned into it, just enough to say, "I remember yesterday. After breakfast, eggs for Jack, a slice of pan-fried meat for his guest, they stepped outside. The chill in the air hinted at early autumn. The dog sniffed the wind, scanned the woods, then sat at Jack's feet. Not restless, not distracted, focused, like he was guarding something. Or someone. Jack knelt. "You don't act like a stray," he said softly. "You act like a soldier." He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo, then uploaded it to a lost and found animal board online. No tag, no chip, but someone might be looking for him. Jack tried not to think about what kind of person would let a dog like this near a cliff's edge without a leash, or whether they ever wanted him back at all. Throughout the day, the shepherd stayed close. Too close. If Jack left the room, the dog followed. If he stepped outside, the dog was at his heel. Not annoying, not clingy, just present, in a way Jack hadn't felt in years, since before the divorce, since before the house got too quiet. But there was something else, a weight in the dog's gaze, as if he was expecting something to happen, something bad. Jack caught him staring at the windows, listening too long to distant sounds. The dog would sometimes sit and face the front door for minutes at a time, unmoving, as if waiting for it to burst open. That night, Jack lit a fire and sat with a cup of tea while the shepherd lay beside him. The room glowed with warmth, but something inside Jack still felt cold. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was how quickly the dog had latched onto him. Maybe it was how trained he seemed, too trained. Or maybe it was the growing feeling that this dog hadn't been lost at all. He'd been running. Jack stared into the flames and tried to shake it off. But deep down, he already knew the truth. That cliff hadn't just been a moment of danger. It had been a moment of escape. And the question wasn't who left this dog behind. The question was, who was coming back to find him? Jack sat at the kitchen table, the morning light washing over a spiral notebook and an untouched cup of coffee. The German shepherd lay by the door, watching, always watching. Jack stared at the open page where he'd written, no name, no tag, no chip, no history. It was the kind of blank slate that didn't exist in the real world, and yet, here this dog was, silent, still, and full of questions he couldn't answer. He had called every shelter within 100 miles, emailed rescues, posted on forums, uploaded pictures to lost pet websites. Nothing, no replies, no hits, not even a maybe. It was as if the dog had dropped from the sky, or like someone had worked very hard to make sure he disappeared. Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Who are you?" he muttered. The dog raised his head slightly at the sound, ears twitching, but gave no other response. His eyes, deep and amber, held an intelligence Jack couldn't deny. This wasn't just instinct. This was memory. This dog had seen things, been places, maybe even done things he shouldn't have. He tried the next obvious step. Jack grabbed a small flashlight and checked the dog's body carefully. No microchip scar behind the neck. No tattoo on the inner thigh, like the ones they used for military or security K9s. But something else stood out, a faint indentation around the neck. A collar had been there for a long time, recently removed, purposely removed. Jack exhaled slowly. He knew what that meant. Someone had erased this dog's identity. He stood up and walked to the old cedar chest in the hallway, digging through supplies until he found an old collar from his previous dog, Scout. Gone nearly 5 years now. He knelt and gently clipped it around the shepherd's neck. "Can't keep calling you dog," he said with a smile. The shepherd tilted his head again, eyes softening. "Scout saved my life once," Jack added quietly. "Maybe that's just something dogs like you do." The name stuck. Scout. That evening, they sat outside as the wind picked up. Scout lay beside Jack's feet, chin resting on his boots. The stars blinked overhead, and Jack found himself staring up at the sky, wondering how this dog had ended up on that cliff. Was he thrown from a truck? Did he escape something? Or someone? Why wasn't anyone looking for him? And then, a thought colder than the night air crept in. What if someone was looking, and not for a reunion, but a cover-up? Jack looked down at Scout, who seemed to feel the shift in mood. His body stiffened slightly, eyes narrowing toward the tree line beyond the property. A long pause, then a low growl, soft but steady, rumbled in his throat. Jack followed his gaze. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean no one was there. He stood and gently tapped his leg. "Inside," he said quietly. Scout obeyed instantly. No barking, no panic, just obedience. Too perfect. Too precise. Jack locked the door behind them and drew the blinds. As he moved through the house, turning off lights, he realized the strangest thing of all. He wasn't afraid of the dog. He was afraid of what might be chasing him. And for the first time, Jack realized rescuing Scout wasn't the end of the story. It was the trigger. The next morning, Jack drove into town with Scout riding quietly in the passenger seat. No leash, no crate, just trust. The shepherd sat upright, still and alert, eyes scanning every tree, every shadow, every passing face. Jack had noticed it more with each passing day. Scout wasn't nervous. He was trained to observe, like a sentry on constant duty. They pulled into the gravel lot outside Millie's general store, the social heartbeat of the town. Jack hadn't planned on bringing Scout inside, but the dog refused to be left alone in the truck. So they walked in together, heads turning immediately. "Well, I'll be..." Millie, the store's 70-something owner, peered over her glasses. "Where'd you get him?" Jack gave a small shrug. "Found him up near Iron Ridge. Almost went over the cliff. I pulled him up." Millie leaned forward. "That dog? You're telling me that dog was loose?" A couple of locals nearby leaned closer. One of them, Earl, an ex-ranger with a memory like a steel trap, narrowed his eyes. "That's not a regular dog," he said. "Look at his posture, his frame. That's a working line German shepherd, maybe Czech or East German. Military bloodlines." Jack nodded slowly. "He's smart, quiet, responds like he's been through serious training." Millie glanced toward Scout, who was now sitting perfectly still by the door, eyes on the street. "You post about him? Lost dog sites?" "Everywhere," Jack replied. "Nothing." Earl looked around cautiously, then lowered his voice. "A few months ago, a couple hikers came through asking strange questions. Said they lost their service dog. But they didn't act like dog people. No panic, no flyers, just cash offers for info. Big money, smelled wrong." Jack's jaw tightened. "What did they look like?" Earl shrugged. "Clean cut, military-style haircuts, SUV with out-of-state plates, stayed one night, then vanished." Millie crossed her arms. "Some folks don't lose dogs, they ditch them, especially if that dog's seen or done something it wasn't supposed to." The words hit Jack hard. He left the store with more than groceries. He left with unease curling around his ribs. Scout walked at his side like always, but Jack felt eyes on them, like someone somewhere had just realized the dog was still alive. Back home, Jack pulled out his laptop and dug deeper. He searched for missing dogs matching Scout's description, expanded the radius, used forums used by law enforcement and handlers. Then he found something buried on an obscure message board. K9-17, male shepherd, ex-confidential deployment, retired early, missing, reward, no questions, contact direct. The post had no photo, but the code stuck in his head. He copied it, cross-referenced it, followed a string of breadcrumbs until he reached an archive page from a security contractor site. K9-17. Status, terminated from service. Notes. Aggression spike, failed final obedience. Relocated. Jack turned to Scout, who now sat by the fireplace, eyes half-lidded but not asleep, always halfway aware. "What were you trained to do?" Jack whispered. Scout looked up, tilted his head, and patted over. He didn't bark. He never barked. Instead, he laid beside Jack's chair like he belonged there. Like he wasn't a ghost from a broken past. But Jack's hands were cold, because now it was real. Someone out there was looking for this dog, and they didn't want to find him to bring him home. They wanted to make sure he stayed lost. The next few days passed quietly, too quietly. Jack tried to fall back into routine, chopping wood, clearing brush, repairing a few fence posts near the east side of the cabin. But Scout's behavior began to shift, subtle at first. He started waking in the middle of the night, pacing the front door with stiff legs and low growls. Always toward the woods, always just after midnight. Jack set up a trail cam facing the tree line. Nothing came of it the first night, but the second morning, when he checked the memory card, the footage froze him in place. A tall figure stood at the edge of the frame, too distant to identify, but clearly watching the cabin. No flashlight, no movement, just stillness, like a silhouette carved out of the forest itself. That afternoon, Jack reinforced the locks on every door and window. He didn't call the police, not yet. He didn't even know what to tell them. Someone might be watching me because I rescued a highly trained dog with no name and a buried past. Wasn't exactly a police report, but his instincts, the same ones that saved him on the cliffs, were screaming. This wasn't random. Scout too seemed to know. His body moved differently now, less relaxed, more tactical. He began checking rooms before settling down, sniffing door frames, pausing near the floorboards as if listening for vibrations Jack couldn't hear. And always, he slept with one eye half open, like something inside him had reawakened. Then came the power outage. It was just after dusk. Jack had just lit the wood stove when the lights flickered and died. No wind, no storm, no explanation. He stepped outside and checked the breaker. All fine. The grid should have held. But the silence around the cabin now felt engineered, not accidental, too still, too complete. That night, Jack slept in a chair by the door, a rifle resting across his lap. Scout curled by his feet but didn't sleep. Not once. His ears twitched at the smallest noise. His head lifted at every creak in the walls. When the wind picked up around 3 a.m., Scout rose and moved to the window. He growled, but not at the sound. At something beneath the sound. Jack stepped beside him, peering through the slats. Again, nothing. Just trees. But Scout's instincts didn't lie. The next morning, Jack walked the perimeter and found fresh boot prints near the edge of the creek. Heavy ones, not his, and certainly not a hiker's. No townie wandered this far into the woods without reason, especially in the dark. Whoever it was, they had been close. Too close. Jack returned to the house with one thought circling in his mind. They hadn't found the dog by accident. They had tracked him. He looked at Scout, now lying in the sun-drenched kitchen doorway, calm again, but different, as if part of him had switched back on. Jack knelt beside him and whispered, "Who trained you to fear the dark?" Scout didn't flinch, didn't blink. He only rested his head gently against Jack's hand, and Jack finally understood. This dog hadn't been rescued from the cliff. He'd been escaping something worse waiting on solid ground. The woods had never felt menacing before. Jack had lived on the edge of them for nearly 12 years, splitting firewood, hiking trails, listening to coyotes howl at the moon. But now, every tree seemed to lean in. Every branch creaked like a whispered warning. And ever since the power outage, Scout had been on edge, more alert, more reactive, as though some forgotten instinct had taken over. That morning, while walking the ridge behind the cabin, Jack found something new. A fresh break in the tree line. Someone, or something, had moved through, leaving branches snapped and a path carved into the undergrowth. Jack crouched and examined the ground. More boot prints, deep, recent. Whoever was out here wasn't wandering. They had a destination. And Scout, he had already found it. The shepherd stood motionless several yards ahead, eyes fixed on the shadows beneath the pines. His ears were forward, tail stiff, body crouched, not in fear, but in focus. Jack followed his line of sight and scanned the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. Then, movement. Barely a flicker. A shift between the trees. Gone as quickly as it appeared. Jack took a cautious step forward. "Scout, back," he whispered. The dog didn't budge. His body was stone. Then, without warning, he emitted a sound Jack hadn't heard since the cliff. A low, guttural growl from deep in his chest. Whoever was out there wasn't a wild animal. Scout knew the difference. Suddenly, the forest erupted with noise. A bird shot out of the brush. Then silence again. Jack held his breath. Was it a trick? A distraction? He turned, just in time to see a black shape disappear into the woods. It was a man, no question. Black jacket, fast movement, no sound. But it wasn't just that someone was watching. It was how close they had been. Just beyond the trees, less than 50 feet away. Scout didn't chase. He turned back to Jack and sat. Calm now. Not relaxed, but reassured. Like he'd known the man would run. Like he'd seen it before. Back at the cabin, Jack made his decision. He pulled an old lockbox from under the floorboards, opened it, and placed a 9mm pistol on the table. It had been years since he'd needed it, but something told him the time for hoping this would all pass quietly had ended. That evening, Scout refused to leave the front window. He lay there for hours, ears twitching at every distant noise. Jack tried to sleep, but his mind raced. Who was the man in the woods? A trainer? A handler? Or someone trying to bury whatever secret Scout might carry? By 2 a.m., the wind had died, and the forest fell eerily silent again. That's when Scout growled, not at the door, but at the roof. Jack sat up, heart thudding. There it was, a soft creak. Above them. Scout was already at the back door, body low, gaze fixed on the ceiling. Jack crept through the hall, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. He aimed the beam upward. Nothing. Then a rustle behind the chimney, a thud, and then footsteps sprinting across the roof and leaping off into the dark. Jack ran around the house, gun drawn, flashlight sweeping wildly. But whoever it was had vanished into the trees again. He returned inside to find Scout sitting at the center of the living room, tail still, posture rigid. His eyes met Jack's, and they held for a long time. They weren't safe anymore, and now someone knew exactly where to find them. Something changed in Scout after the roof incident. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't subtle, it was instant, like a switch had been flipped, and a new version of him had emerged from the shadows. The following morning, Jack noticed it in the way Scout moved. No more aimless pacing or cautious posture. Now, every step was deliberate, every glance was calculated. He no longer just reacted to his surroundings, he controlled them. While Jack boiled water for coffee, Scout walked the house perimeter, not sniffing, sweeping. He paused at doors and windows, turned slowly, scanning every angle like a soldier on patrol. It wasn't paranoia, it was training, rehearsed behavior rising to the surface, triggered by something buried deep. Jack tried calling his name. Scout! The shepherd stopped, turned, stared. There was a pause, just a second, but enough for Jack to feel it. The dog was assessing him, measuring intent. For the first time since the rescue, Scout wasn't just a companion. He was something else entirely. Jack placed the coffee cup down and walked toward him. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Scout blinked and broke the stare. He turned and sat down near the window again, but his body remained tense, watchful, waiting. That's when Jack noticed the scars, not just on his legs, but beneath the fur on his neck and ribs. They were faded, old, but unmistakably surgical, controlled, calculated. Not injuries from the wild, not from fights, from people. Later that day, Jack pulled up footage from the trail cam again, hoping to catch another glimpse of the man in the woods. Nothing new, but when he stepped away from the screen, he realized Scout had been watching it too, closely. When Jack rewound the footage and paused on the figure, Scout stood up. His body stiffened, his lips pulled back slightly, not in fear, in recognition. Jack felt his stomach drop. "You know him?" Scout sat down again, but his eyes never left the screen. The image of the man remained frozen on the monitor, his face obscured, but his silhouette clear. Broad shoulders, confident stance. Whoever he wasn't surprised by danger. He expected it. Jack shut off the monitor. "I think I need to know what you were before I met you." That night, Scout's behavior shifted again. He didn't sleep by the door. He didn't rest beside the bed. Instead, he lay directly across the entryway, blocking it completely, facing outward. His body was silent, but humming with alertness, like he was on assignment. Like the house was no longer a home, but a post. At 3:13 a.m., Jack was awoken by a sound he hadn't heard before. A low, rhythmic chuff, half breath, half warning. Not a growl, not a bark, a signal. Jack sat up and saw Scout already standing, tail straight, gaze locked on the back door. There was nothing there, but Scout's instincts weren't wrong. The next morning, Scout refused to eat. He stood by the window and stared into the woods for nearly an hour. Jack sat beside him, speaking softly. "You're not just a rescue, you're someone's weapon, but not anymore." Scout looked at him, no longer cautious, no longer lost. Something inside the dog had shifted. He wasn't hiding from his past anymore. He was preparing to confront it. The wind that night didn't howl, it whispered, a soft, steady murmur through the trees, brushing the cabin with an eerie calm. Jack had just finished securing the last window when he felt it, that tightening in the chest, like something pressing in from all sides. Scout stood near the fireplace, ears tilted slightly forward, eyes locked on the door. He hadn't moved in over an hour. Jack kept the lights low, flashlight nearby, gun within arm's reach. He'd already alerted Earl from town earlier that day, just in case. No police, not yet. Too many unknowns, too many things that didn't add up. They were being watched. Of that, he was certain. It started just past midnight. A soft knock, not pounding, not aggressive, just deliberate. Jack froze. Scout didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood and moved toward the door, placing his body directly in front of it, like a living barrier. Another knock, then a voice. "Mr. Harper, we know you have him. We don't want trouble." Jack's heart skipped. The voice was calm, cold, professional. Scout growled, low and deep, still not barking, controlled. Jack raised his voice. "Who are you?" A pause. Then, "You don't know what he is. You don't know what he's capable of. Open the door." Jack stepped back, rifle in hand. "You come near this house, and I promise you'll regret it." Silence. Then the explosion. Not at the door, but at the back of the cabin. A window burst inward, shattering glass across the living room. Smoke filled the air. Scout sprang into motion, launching toward the sound like a fired arrow. Jack ducked, coughing, eyes watering. Someone had tossed a flashbang, or something close. The rear door burst open. 2 figures, black tactical gear, moving fast. But they hadn't planned on Scout. The first man didn't even make it through the doorway. Scout hit him mid-chest, teeth bared, body slamming into his like a freight train. They crashed into the floor. The second man raised something. Jack couldn't see if it was a weapon or tranquilizer. He didn't wait. One shot rang out. The second figure dropped. Smoke still curled in the air. Alarms from the motion sensors outside began to blare. Scout held the first intruder pinned, jaws locked around the man's wrist. The man screamed. Jack kicked the weapon out of his reach and shouted, "Let him go!" Scout obeyed instantly, stepping back, but still ready to strike again. Sirens began to wail in the distance. Earl had called backup. Jack stood over the intruder, breathing hard. "Who sent you?" The man didn't speak, just stared, eyes wide, as if stunned Scout hadn't finished the job. The front door remained unopened. Whoever was out there, whoever had given the command, had backed off. Scout turned to Jack, body trembling not from fear, but from restraint. He hadn't lost control. He hadn't snapped. He had chosen, and his choice was to protect. By the time authorities arrived, the intruder was unconscious, the second one bleeding, but stable. The local sheriff took one look at the gear they wore and muttered, "These guys aren't from around here?" Jack didn't answer. He just knelt beside Scout, running a hand over his back. "You saved us," he whispered. "You knew this would happen, and you still stayed." Scout leaned into the touch. No tail wag, no celebration. Just purpose fulfilled. That night, as the lights of the patrol cars faded, Jack sat with Scout on the cabin steps. The stars above flickered like nothing had changed, but everything had. Because now, everyone knew what Scout was truly capable of, and some would stop at nothing to silence it. The morning after the attack, the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Jack walked through the splintered living room, boots crunching glass beneath his steps. The air still smelled of smoke and cold metal. Scout followed behind him, nose low, scanning the floor for traces. Scent trails, movement, anything left behind. He paused near the back window, sniffed once, and looked at Jack. "They were in here before," Jack muttered. It wasn't a guess, it was a certainty. The way the flashbang had landed, the speed of the entry. These men had known the layout of the house, the room sizes, entry points, blind spots. That wasn't random, that was surveillance. Jack stepped outside and walked to the edge of the property line, where trees met fence. Scout moved ahead of him, silent as shadow. Jack reached the base of an old pine and froze. Buried in the brush was something small, rectangular, black. A trail cam. But not his. Jack picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands. The casing was matte and unmarked. No manufacturer logo, military grade, no blinking lights, no sounds. Hidden too well for a hiker to stumble on it by chance. Scout circled behind him and stared up the ridge. Jack followed his gaze and saw a glint of glass in the trees. Another one. They weren't just being watched from the trees. They'd been monitored for days, maybe longer. Back inside, Jack powered on his laptop, and started scanning through nearby networks. His fingers flew over the keys, years of off-the-grid know-how finally being put to use. There it was, an encrypted signal broadcasting intermittently, piggybacking on a nearby cell tower. Not commercial, not residential. Jack traced it to a router a few miles away, somewhere deep in the forest where no house had ever been listed. A temporary uplink station. Whoever had placed the cameras was transmitting the footage live, watching from somewhere nearby. Scout stood by the front door, tail twitching. Jack could feel the tension returning, the pressure. He'd hoped the assault was the end. But it was only the middle. These weren't thugs. They were professionals, trained, funded, organized, and Scout. He wasn't just a trained animal. He was a liability, a witness. Jack grabbed his rifle, checked the ammo, then pulled out the bug-out bag from under the floorboards. He stuffed it with essentials, maps, food, cash, hard drives. He clipped a satellite phone to his belt and pulled out the tags from the attacker's gear. No name, no rank. Just stitched serials and a strange insignia, a triangle with a bar through it. He uploaded the image into a facial recognition forum used by a few former contacts. Not official, but reliable. While waiting, he turned to Scout, who now sat perfectly still, waiting. "You ready to disappear again?" Jack asked. Scout didn't move, didn't blink. He was ready. But just as Jack zipped the bag, his screen lit up. Match found. One of the men had worked for a private contractor, defense-related, blacklisted 3 years ago after a leaked investigation. No official files, no press. The name of the company was redacted, but the triangle insignia, it matched. Jack closed the laptop slowly. "They didn't just train you," he whispered. "They built you, then tried to bury you." Scout stood up, no hesitation, no fear. Because now, they both knew the truth. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The cabin felt different now. Not like home, not like sanctuary, but like a sealed room before a storm breaks the windows. Jack double-checked the deadbolts, then sat at the kitchen table with Scout lying nearby, motionless except for his eyes, which followed every move. The laptop screen still glowed with the last search result. The blacklisted contractor, the redacted files, the triangle insignia that had haunted the background of this story from the very beginning. Jack leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "There's more to this," he muttered. "We're missing something." His gaze dropped to Scout's collar, the old one he'd fastened around the dog's neck weeks ago after the rescue. It had been temporary, just something to make him feel like a normal pet. But now, it felt wrong. The dog had come from somewhere built for precision. There had to be a trace left behind, somewhere physical. He knelt beside Scout and unclipped the collar. The shepherd sat patiently, still as stone. Jack turned it over in his hands, then paused. Something about the stitching on the underside seemed off. Thicker, newer, reinforced. Jack grabbed a small pocket knife from the drawer and carefully sliced open the inner lining. It peeled away, revealing a small, folded square of plastic embedded inside the leather. Not metal, not a tracker, a data chip. Jack's breath caught. He placed the chip into a USB adapter and plugged it into the laptop. It took seconds to load. A folder appeared, unnamed, hidden from default view. Inside were scanned documents, medical records, training logs, and one chilling header that repeated across several pages. Project Revenant, classified K9 program. Jack scrolled through. The records were detailed. Scout wasn't just a trained dog, he was part of an experimental program designed to enhance working dog cognition, stress conditioning, obedience under trauma, memory-based pattern response. It wasn't just about loyalty. It was about control. One line made Jack's stomach turn. Test subject K917 displayed exceptional response to advanced behavior imprinting, but failed final phase due to emotional resistance to lethal engagement. Scout hadn't escaped because he was broken. He'd escaped because he refused to become what they built. Jack sat back in his chair, heart pounding. These weren't just handlers looking to recover property. They were trying to erase evidence of a program that went too far, one they couldn't risk exposing. He looked at Scout, who now sat upright, eyes locked on him. "You walked away," Jack whispered. "That's why they're coming." Scout rested his head gently against Jack's knee, not for comfort, but for acknowledgement, as if to say, Yes. And I'd do it again. Then Jack found the final file in the folder. Target location, subject retrieval, designated contact in vicinity. Attached was a satellite image of Jack's cabin, taken before the rescue. Jack's blood ran cold. They were tracking you before I ever saw you on that cliff. Scout didn't move. He didn't have to. He already knew. Jack closed the laptop, stood slowly, and stared out the window. The trees were still, but somewhere out there, men were moving, planning, closing in, not because of what Scout might do, but because of what he had already chosen not to. He wasn't their weapon anymore. He had become their greatest threat. And now, the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Everything they needed to fight back was buried beneath a collar. The wind howled along the ridge, whistling through the cracks of memory. Jack stood at the edge of the same cliff where it had all begun, where Scout had been hanging by a thread, his paws scrabbling for grip, his eyes wild with silent panic. But now, with everything he'd learned, Jack understood. That moment hadn't been an accident. It was never a random fall. Scout had run, not from danger, but from destiny. The documents in the collar told more than Jack had ever imagined. Scout, or K-917, had been scheduled for final decommissioning due to non-compliance in terminal scenarios. It wasn't that he'd failed, it was that he'd refused to kill, and that refusal had made him disposable. They didn't let dogs like that retire, they erased them. Jack closed his eyes and saw it clearly. The dark transport van, the remote forest road, Scout breaking free during a transfer, running hard, fast, toward the cliffs, toward freedom, or death. Whatever came first. The cliff wasn't the end. It was supposed to be his escape plan, but Jack had interrupted it, had reached for him, saved him, pulled him back into a world Scout had already given up on. Jack crouched at the cliff's edge and looked down, the wind tugging at his coat. "You weren't meant to survive that day," he said softly. Behind him, Scout sat like a silent guardian, eyes scanning the horizon. Everything made sense now. The silence, the obedience, the restraint. Scout had never been afraid of humans. He'd been afraid of becoming one of them. That's why he didn't bark, why he didn't attack, even when trained to. He was holding back the very thing they had spent years forcing into him. And when Jack had pulled him up, that leash hadn't just saved a life, it had given one back. The truth was brutal. But it was also clear. Scout had chosen to run, and by chance, or fate, he had been found by the one man who wouldn't ask him to become something else again, who didn't need a weapon, who didn't want a tool, just a companion. Jack stood slowly. "They wanted you to forget what you were," he said, "but they never expected you to remember who you are." Scout rose beside him, body tall, unmoving, every line of him drawn sharp by the setting sun. Jack reached down and ruffled the fur behind his ears. "You weren't the one who needed rescuing that day, were you?" Scout leaned into his hand, and Jack finally understood why he had reached forward, why he hadn't hesitated at the cliff. Because deep down, in that split second, he had seen it in the dog's eyes. Not a plea for life, but a question. Would anyone ever fight for him, the way he'd refused to fight for them? And Jack had answered with a grip that didn't let go, a bond that couldn't be unmade. Now, the enemy was closing in again. Jack knew it. Scout knew it. But they wouldn't run. Not this time. Because the truth wasn't just behind the rescue. It was the reason for everything that followed. The evening brought a heavy fog that crawled between the trees like smoke from an invisible fire. Jack and Scout had returned to the cabin, but neither spoke, neither truly rested. Something had shifted in the air, like a string pulled too tight, waiting to snap. Scout stood near the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the door again, his body still but brimming with tension. Then it came, a chirp, faint, mechanical. Jack reached for the device on the table, a signal scanner. The screen lit up, frequency spike, encrypted ping. Someone had triggered a locator, not civilian, not random, they were here. Jack moved fast. Scout was already ahead of him, moving like he'd been waiting for the moment. He darted to the hallway, paused, then looked back at Jack, ready for command. The past wasn't just returning, it was activating. Jack opened the safe and pulled out a secured case. Inside, a tactical headset, an encrypted flash drive, and something he hadn't touched in 10 years. An old ID badge from his former days in military tech research. He had buried this life for a reason. Now, it was clawing back to the surface, just like Scout's. Scout stood beside him now, eyes sharp, focused, ready. The cabin lights flickered. Outside, silence pressed against the walls like a wave waiting to crash. Then, the first shot. Not a bang, but a pop, muffled and precise. A warning. Jack dropped low. Back entrance, now. He grabbed the hard drive, stuffed it in his pack, and followed Scout through the kitchen and into the woods beyond. They moved fast, silent, along a trail only they knew. The forest swallowed them in seconds. Behind them, a vehicle approached, unmarked, matte black. Its tires crunched gravel like bones underfoot. Scout led Jack to a ravine. He stopped, crouched, and scanned the ridge above. A glint of light. A figure with night vision. Another step closer, and they'd be surrounded. Jack pulled out a flare gun. He didn't aim to fight. He aimed to signal. He fired the flare high above the trees. It burst in red, brilliant and loud. A warning, a beacon, but most importantly, a trigger. Scout turned toward the noise and growled, not from instinct, but from memory. Something in him had reawakened. Suddenly his body shifted, not wild, but tactical. He weaved between trees, flanking the left side of the ridge. Jack knew better than to stop him now. The soldier and Scout had returned, not by force, but by choice. The attackers didn't expect resistance. They thought Scout would be running scared. They were wrong. Scout struck from the shadows, fast, silent. The first man dropped with a cry. Jack circled around and grabbed his weapon. They fought like two halves of the same instinct. One human, one beast, but bound by the same code. Survive, protect, expose. The past didn't just come back to haunt them. It came back to finish what it started. But now, Scout wasn't alone, and Jack wasn't afraid. By dawn, the last of the invaders had vanished into the forest, leaving blood, footprints, and silence in their wake. Scout returned, panting but unharmed. His eyes met Jack's. No bark, no tail wag, just a nod. He remembered everything, and he had made his choice. They weren't running anymore. They were hunting back. Because when you bury the truth deep enough, one day, it digs itself out. The morning after the attack, sunlight filtered through the trees like gold-dusted silence. The forest, once a shadowy prison of secrets and surveillance, now felt open, cleansed. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Scout pace slowly near the stream, nose low, tail still, ears alert. Not tense, just aware, present. Scout looked different now, not physically, but in presence. His posture no longer carried the weight of fear or confusion. He moved with clarity, like something unspoken had finally been accepted. He was no longer hiding from what he was. He had reclaimed it. Jack walked over, sitting on a rock as the stream bubbled at his feet. Scout approached and lay beside him, their shadows stretching together across the grass. Neither needed to speak. So much had been said in silence, through choices made under pressure, through instincts tested in the dark. "I don't think I saved you," Jack said quietly. "I think you were waiting for a reason to live." Scout blinked, eyes soft but steady. He wasn't a weapon anymore. He wasn't a ghost of a project someone wanted buried. He was his own story now. The government team never came back, not officially. Jack suspected they realized it was too risky. Scout had proven more than defiant. He had proven unpredictable, and no organization trained in control wanted to chase what they couldn't leash. A week passed, then two. Jack began repairing the cabin, replacing windows, reinforcing walls. Not out of fear, but because they weren't going anywhere. Scout never left his side. When Jack hiked the ridge, Scout was there. When Jack split wood, Scout kept watch. When Jack sat in silence at dusk, Scout lay beside him like a sentinel made of loyalty and resolve. The data drive remained hidden, its contents encrypted and secure. Someday Jack might expose it, might let the world know what was done in the name of progress. But not yet. Not until Scout was ready. One evening, Jack tossed Scout a new collar, handmade, plain leather, no lining, no secrets. Scout sniffed it, nudged it once, then sat patiently as Jack fastened it around his neck. "No more numbers," Jack said. "No more projects, Just you. Scout's ears twitched at the sound of his name. His real name, Scout, not K917. Not a ghost. A dog. A survivor. A friend. That night, as stars filled the sky, Jack watched the fire flicker inside the cabin. Scout lay at the edge of the porch, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. The silence was finally peaceful, not ominous, not waiting, just still. Jack took a deep breath and smiled. "You chose freedom," he said, "even when it nearly killed you." Scout lifted his head slowly, then lowered it again, content. He could have given in to what they made him, could have followed the path carved out by fear and pain, but he hadn't. He had jumped off that truck, fought through the woods, hung off that cliff, and he had looked up. He had hoped. He had trusted that someone would reach back, and someone did. Not to command him, not to break him, but to set him free. Now, the danger was behind them. The scars would remain, but so would the bond, the choice that Scout made again and again, to stay, to protect, to live. Because in the end, he wasn't just the dog who was rescued from a cliff. He was the dog who chose to be free.